to look at your situation through the eyes of your flesh, self would tell you that you ought to just be depressed. If you were to look at the state that you find yourself in and all that surrounds you and all that you've gone through, it would seem like you have nothing to be excited about. But you ought to just get excited. For the joy of the Lord is your strength, and this joy that you have, the world didn't give it to you. Don't allow the world to take it away. You ought to just get excited. You ought to be excited about the decisions that God is making on your behalf. You ought to be excited about the plan and the purpose that God has for your life. You ought to be excited about the traffic that surrounds you in the spirit realm. You ought to just get excited. You ought to get excited about the word that God has sent out over your life, and now it's hovering over you until it accomplishes that which God sent it out to accomplish. You ought to just get excited because his word shall not return unto him void. You ought to just get excited about whatever your next is. You ought to get excited about your next level. You ought to get excited about your next success. You ought to get excited about your next promotion or maybe your next demotion, because Joseph's life says that whatever goes down must come back up again. You ought to just get excited. You ought to 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 just get excited. You've got something to be excited about, and you ought not cry and complain, but you ought to just get excited about the move of God in your life. You ought to get excited about all that God has already done. You ought to get excited about what God is in the midst of doing. You ought to get excited about what God is getting ready to do. You ought to just get excited, for this is the day that the Lord has made, and you ought to just learn how to rejoice and be glad in it. And if there is nothing about this day that causes you to get excited, you ought to just get excited about that day, because that future day will come, and that future day will turn into this day, and on that day you will realize that this is the day that I saw in my dreams, and this is the day that I've been having faith for, and this is the day that had already been established and predestined. This is the day that I had been waiting on to manifest, and this is the day that is subject to my favor, my destiny, and my purpose. This is the day that the Lord has made, and you ought to just get excited. 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 You ought to just get excited.